The sound of paper tearing cut through my mother's hospital room like a blade through silk, sharp, decisive, and utterly final. I let the pieces of the $47,000 check flutter to the sterile floor like snow, each fragment carrying 30 years of resentment, disappointment, and the crushing weight of being perpetually second best in my own family's eyes. "Violet!" My mother's voice was weak from the chemotherapy, but her shock was strong enough to cut through the morphine haze. "What have you done?" "That was for my treatment. For 30 years, I've heard the same refrain," I said, my voice steady, despite the earthquake of emotion churning in my chest. "You'll never be like your perfect brother Marcus. You'll never achieve what he has. You'll never make us as proud as he does." I gestured to the scattered check pieces, "Then ask him to pay for your treatment." My father, who had been dozing in the uncomfortable hospital chair, jolted awake at the commotion. His eyes widened as he processed the scene, his daughter standing over the remains of a check that represented his wife's chance at survival, her face set with a determination he'd never seen before. "Violet, you're being irrational," he said, his voice carrying that same patronizing tone he'd used when I'd graduated medical school, when I'd bought my first house, when I'd achieved every milestone that somehow paled in comparison to whatever Marcus was supposedly accomplishing on the other side of the country. "Your mother needs this surgery. This isn't the time for petty jealousy." Petty jealousy. 34 years of life reduced to petty jealousy, because I'd finally refused to bankroll their worship of a son who hadn't visited home in 3 years, hadn't called on birthdays or holidays, and hadn't contributed a single dollar to the medical crisis that was supposedly too urgent for anyone but me to handle. "Where is Marcus?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Where is your perfect son while his mother fights cancer? Where is the golden child who's supposedly so successful, so accomplished, so much better than his disappointing sister?" My parents exchanged the look they'd perfected over decades of my childhood, the weary expression of people burdened with a difficult daughter who couldn't understand her place in the family hierarchy. "Marcus is building his consulting empire in California," my mother said weakly, as if reciting a prayer she'd memorized. "He can't just drop everything and fly across the country every time there's a family emergency. He has responsibilities, employees who depend on him. And I don't?" The question hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. "I don't have responsibilities? I don't have a career that matters? I don't have anything more important to do than write checks for the family that's never once acknowledged my existence except when they need something?" Dr. Sarah Chen, my colleague from Pacific Medical Center, chose that moment to knock on the door. Her timing was perfect, or perhaps catastrophic, depending on one's perspective on family melodrama playing out in oncology wards. "Violet, I got your message about needing to discuss." She stopped mid-sentence as she took in the scene. The torn check, my parents' shocked faces, the tension thick enough to require surgical removal. "Dr. Chen," my father said, recognition dawning in his voice. "You work with Violet?" Sarah's confusion was understandable. My parents had never shown interest in my medical career beyond accepting the financial support it provided. They'd never visited my hospital, never met my colleagues, never asked about the surgeries I performed, or the lives I saved. "Work with her?" Sarah laughed, though the sound held more bewilderment than humor. "Mr. and Mrs. Morrison, Violet is our chief of pediatric cardiothoracic surgery. She's one of the most respected surgeons on the West Coast. I work for her." The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear my mother's heart monitor beeping, my father's labored breathing, and the sound of 30 years of assumptions crashing to the ground like a house of cards in a hurricane. "That's impossible," my mother whispered. "Violet works at some small clinic doing routine procedures. She couldn't be." "A chief of surgery at one of the most prestigious medical centers in the country?" Sarah's voice carried the professional authority that came from years of medical training and the confidence of someone who'd never been told she was inferior to a sibling she'd never met. "She's been featured in 3 medical journals this year alone. Her innovative techniques have revolutionized pediatric heart surgery." My father stared at me as if seeing me for the first time in 34 years. "Why didn't you tell us?" "Because you never asked," I said simply. "Because every conversation was about Marcus's latest achievement, Marcus's new business venture, Marcus's incredible success. Because when I tried to share my accomplishments, you changed the subject to talk about how proud you were of your real child." I bent down and gathered the pieces of the check, holding them like evidence in a trial where I was simultaneously plaintiff, defendant, and judge. "I've been supporting this family for 8 years. I continued. Paying your mortgage, covering Dad's medical expenses, funding Mom's treatments, all while listening to endless praise for a son who contributes nothing but disappointment and excuses. My mother's face crumpled as the full weight of the revelation hit her. Violet, we didn't know. You didn't know because you didn't want to know. You didn't know because acknowledging my success would mean admitting you were wrong about which child deserved your pride and investment. I walked toward the door, leaving my parents to process the destruction of their carefully maintained family mythology. If you need money for treatment, I said without turning back, call your perfect son. I'm sure he'll be happy to help the family that's always believed in him. Growing up in the Morrison household meant understanding from birth that there were two distinct categories of children. Marcus, who could do no wrong, and me, who could do nothing right. The evidence of this hierarchy filled every corner of our family home like a museum dedicated to sibling inequality. Marcus's bedroom wall was covered with certificates, trophies, and framed photographs documenting his journey from promising child to exceptional teenager to supposedly successful adult. Academic achievement awards, athletic trophies, newspaper clippings featuring his debate team victories, every accomplishment carefully preserved and displayed like religious artifacts in a shrine to parental pride. My room, by contrast, was utilitarian and sparse. When I brought home my first academic award, a state-level mathematics competition victory when I was 12, my mother had smiled politely and suggested I put it in my desk drawer so it wouldn't create clutter on my dresser. We don't want to seem like we're bragging, she'd said, though Marcus's achievements were displayed prominently in the living room for every visitor to admire. The pattern had been established early and reinforced constantly. When Marcus made varsity football as a sophomore, the entire extended family was invited to celebrate his athletic prowess. When I was accepted into the gifted program and skipped a grade, the accomplishment was mentioned briefly at dinner, before the conversation shifted to Marcus's upcoming homecoming dance. Different children have different gifts, my father would explain, when relatives noticed the disparity in attention. Marcus has natural leadership qualities and social intelligence. Violet is more of a studious type. The phrase carried all the enthusiasm of describing someone as having a pleasant personality or being very responsible, qualities that were useful but hardly inspiring. Marcus had learned to leverage his golden child status with sophisticated manipulation tactics that would have impressed corporate executives. When he wanted something, a car, expensive clothes, permission to attend parties, he would deploy charm and emotional appeals that left our parents grateful for the privilege of saying yes to their wonderful son. When I needed something, textbooks, transportation to academic competitions, basic necessities for school, I learned to approach the request like a business proposal, providing detailed justifications for why the expense was reasonable and necessary. The difference in treatment extended beyond material goods to fundamental family dynamics. Marcus's failures were reframed as learning experiences or evidence of his high standards and ambitious nature. When he was suspended from school for cheating on a chemistry exam, my parents spent hours discussing how the academic system failed to recognize his creative problem-solving approach. When I received a B+ in art class, my only non-A grade in high school, I endured a 30-minute lecture about the importance of excellence in all areas, not just the subjects that came naturally to me. "We expect more from you, Violet," my mother had said, her disappointment palpable. "Marcus has so many demands on his time with sports and student government. You have the luxury of focusing entirely on academics, the luxury of being overlooked, the privilege of having no social life or extracurricular activities because academic achievement was apparently my only viable path to parental attention that never materialized regardless of my performance." Marcus's college acceptance to a moderately prestigious state university was celebrated with a family party, personalized announcements, and months of proud conversation with neighbors and relatives. My acceptance to 3 Ivy League schools, including a full scholarship to Harvard, was acknowledged with a brief congratulations before the focus shifted to helping Marcus choose his dorm room furniture. "We're proud of you, sweetheart," my father had said when I showed him my Harvard acceptance letter. "But you know college isn't everything. Marcus has the kind of personality that will serve him well, regardless of where he goes to school." Personality. As if intelligence, dedication, and actual achievement were less valuable than whatever intangible qualities Marcus possessed that made him naturally superior to his academically successful sister. The family narrative became so entrenched that I began to believe it myself. Maybe I was just book smart. while Marcus had real-world intelligence. Maybe my achievements were the result of obsessive studying, while his success came from natural talent. Maybe I was the backup child, valuable only for my ability to make the family look well-rounded by producing academic accomplishments that complemented Marcus's social achievements. By the time I entered medical school, I had internalized the family hierarchy so completely that I stopped sharing my successes entirely. When I graduated summa cum laude, I didn't mention it at home. When I was accepted into a competitive surgical residency, I told my parents I was doing additional training without explaining its significance. Marcus, meanwhile, had dropped out of college after 2 years to pursue various entrepreneurial ventures that our parents described as evidence of his innovative thinking and willingness to take calculated risks. He's not cut out for traditional academic paths, my mother would explain to relatives who asked about his education. He's more of a visionary, someone who thinks outside conventional frameworks, a visionary who moved back home at 25 and spent his days playing video games while I was completing one of the most demanding training programs in medicine. But pointing out this disparity would have been evidence of my petty jealousy and inability to appreciate my brother's unique gifts. For 15 years, I had accepted my role as the invisible daughter, whose achievements served only to provide financial support for the family's continued worship of their golden child. I had written checks, paid bills, and funded their lifestyle while listening to endless praise for a son who contributed nothing but stories about his latest get-rich-quick scheme. Today, standing in that hospital room surrounded by the torn pieces of my mother's treatment check, I had finally broken free from a role I should never have accepted in the first place. The call had come at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, jolting me awake in my downtown Seattle apartment with the kind of urgency that immediately signals life-altering news. My mother's voice, usually strong and controlled, was reduced to a trembling whisper that barely registered above the hospital's background noise. "Violet, I need you to come home. They found something in my chest x-ray, and the doctors want to run more tests. They're using words like aggressive and advanced stage, and I don't understand what's happening. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. Metastasized to liver and lungs. Life expectancy. 4 to 6 months without treatment. Possibly 18 months with aggressive intervention that would cost more than most people earn in 5 years." I had taken a leave of absence from Pacific Medical Center within 6 hours of my mother's diagnosis, arranging for colleagues to cover my surgeries while I flew to Ohio to navigate the labyrinth of oncology consultations, treatment options, and financial planning that accompanies a terminal cancer diagnosis. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was one of the most respected surgeons on the West Coast, but my expertise in pediatric cardiothoracic surgery was useless against the disease that was systematically destroying my mother's internal organs. The treatment protocol is experimental but promising, Dr. Rebecca Martinez explained during our consultation at Cleveland Clinic. "We're looking at immunotherapy combined with targeted radiation, followed by surgical intervention if the tumors shrink sufficiently." The numbers were staggering. $47,000 for the initial treatment phase, with additional costs potentially reaching $200,000 if surgery became viable. Insurance would cover approximately 60%, leaving the family responsible for expenses that exceeded most people's annual income. "We'll figure out the money," my father had said with the confidence of someone who'd never actually figured out money in his life. "Violet will help us understand the financial options. Violet will help. Not, we'll work together as a family, or, let's explore all possibilities. Violet will help, because that's what Violet does. Solves problems, writes checks, and manages crises, while the rest of the family maintains their comfortable distance from unpleasant realities." I spent 3 days reviewing treatment options, consulting with specialists across the country, and developing a comprehensive care plan that would give my mother the best possible chance of survival. The medical complexity was manageable. The family dynamics were another matter entirely. "Have you contacted Marcus?" I asked during one of our evening discussions about treatment scheduling. My parents exchanged the look they'd perfected over decades, a combination of protective instinct and diplomatic evasion that appeared whenever Marcus's absence became too obvious to ignore. "Marcus is in a very delicate phase of his business development," my mother said carefully. "He's negotiating some major contracts that require his complete attention. We don't want to distract him with family problems when he's on the verge of such important breakthroughs." Family problems. My mother's terminal cancer diagnosis was a family problem that might distract Marcus from his supposedly crucial business negotiations. "Don't you think he'd want to know that his mother is dying?" I asked, though I already knew the answer would involve elaborate explanations about Marcus's sensitivity and the family's responsibility to protect him from emotional stress. "Of course he'll want to know," my father said. "But we need to present the situation in the right way, at the right time, when he's emotionally prepared to handle such devastating news. The right way, at the right time." Marcus needed emotional preparation to hear about his mother's illness, while I was expected to immediately drop my career, arrange extended leave, and relocate across the country to manage a crisis that apparently required delicate handling for everyone except me. "What about the financial aspect?" I pressed. "Surely Marcus would want to contribute to Mom's treatment costs." Another look, another diplomatic pause. "Marcus is investing everything he has into his consulting firm," my mother explained. "He's at a crucial stage where every dollar needs to go toward business expansion. We can't ask him to sacrifice his future prospects for medical expenses, his future prospects versus her current survival. The family's financial sacrifice should come from the daughter whose career was apparently disposable, not the son whose business ventures were too important to interrupt." I had written the check that afternoon, $47,000 drawn on my personal account, representing 2 months of salary and the liquidation of investments I'd been carefully building for my own future. I'd written it without complaint, without resentment, without asking for recognition or gratitude. I'd written it because I loved my mother and wanted her to live, because family obligations transcended personal feelings, because I'd spent 34 years accepting that my role was to solve problems while Marcus was protected from inconvenience. But as I'd sat in that hospital room, listening to my parents discuss their perfect son sensitivity and business priorities, while their dying mother needed immediate medical intervention, something had finally broken inside me. The check represented more than money. It represented 30 years of being taken for granted, 30 years of sacrificing my own needs for people who would never do the same for me, 30 years of funding a family mythology that cast me as supporting character in someone else's success story. When I'd torn it to pieces, I hadn't been destroying my mother's treatment. I'd been destroying a relationship dynamic that had poisoned our family for 3 decades. And for the first time in my life, the destruction felt like freedom. The Pacific Medical Center occupied 12 floors of gleaming steel and glass in downtown Seattle, its modern architecture housing some of the most advanced medical technology and renowned physicians on the West Coast. My office on the 10th floor offered panoramic views of Elliott Bay, but I rarely had time to appreciate the scenery between surgeries that regularly lasted 8 to 12 hours. For 8 years, I had been living a double life that would have impressed professional spies in its elaborate deception and careful compartmentalization. To my family in Ohio, I was Violet Morrison, a doctor who worked at some clinic performing routine procedures that generated enough income to occasionally help with family expenses. To my colleagues, patients, and the broader medical community, I was Dr. Violet Morrison, Chief of Pediatric Cardiothoracic Surgery, whose innovative surgical techniques had been featured in the New England Journal of Medicine, the American Heart Association's annual conference, and CNN's medical documentary series about breakthrough cardiac procedures. The deception hadn't been intentional initially. When I'd completed my residency and been offered the attending position at Pacific Medical Center, I'd called home excitedly to share the news with parents who'd always claimed to want the best for their children. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," my mother had said, her attention clearly divided between my announcement and whatever she was watching on television. "Is Marcus there? I want to tell him about the consulting contract he just secured. 3 Fortune 500 companies are competing for his services. My groundbreaking surgical residency versus Marcus's consulting contract. My 8 years of medical training and selection for one of the most competitive surgical programs in the country versus whatever Marcus claimed to be doing in California that impressed our parents despite producing no visible results." I'd stopped trying to compete for their attention after that conversation. Instead, I'd thrown myself into my work with the kind of intensity that produced extraordinary professional results, and a personal life that existed entirely separate from family expectations. The cases that built my reputation were exactly the kind of complex, high-stakes surgeries that most physicians avoided: infant heart defects that required microscopic precision, pediatric cardiac emergencies that demanded innovative approaches, experimental procedures that could either save children's lives or end my career if they failed. Timothy Chen, age 3, born with hypoplastic left heart syndrome, a fatal condition that I'd treated with a revolutionary 3-stage surgical approach that became the new standard of care for pediatric cardiac centers nationwide. Sophia Rodriguez, age 7, whose complex congenital heart defect had been deemed inoperable by 4 other surgical teams, before I'd developed a technique that repaired her heart through minimally invasive procedures that left barely visible scars. Marcus Williams, age 2, whose parents had traveled from Australia seeking treatment for a rare cardiac condition that I'd successfully addressed using experimental technology that had never been attempted on someone so young. Each success had built my professional reputation, while remaining completely unknown to the family that considered Marcus's undefined consulting work more impressive than saving children's lives through surgical innovation. My annual salary was $847,000, not including speaking fees, consulting income, and research grants that brought my total compensation close to $1.2 million per year. I owned a house in Seattle's Queen Anne neighborhood that had appreciated to $2.3 million, an investment portfolio worth $1.8 million, and enough liquid assets to write 6-figure checks without affecting my financial stability. None of which my family knew, because they'd never expressed interest in my career beyond its utility as a source of occasional financial assistance. The monthly transfers I'd been making to my parents' account, $3,000 that covered their mortgage, utilities, and medical expenses, represented less than 2% of my monthly income. Money I barely noticed leaving my account, money that funded their comfortable retirement and their continued worship of a son who contributed nothing but excuses and disappointment. Dr. Sarah Chen had been trying to convince me to pursue department chair positions at even more prestigious medical centers, opportunities that would have elevated my career to national prominence and increased my earning potential exponentially. "You're wasting your talent in a regional facility," she'd argued during one of our quarterly reviews. "Johns Hopkins has been asking about your availability. Stanford wants to discuss building an entire pediatric cardiac program around your techniques. You could write your own ticket at any institution in the country. But leaving Seattle would have meant acknowledging that I'd been hiding my success from people whose opinions shouldn't have mattered to someone of my professional stature. It would have forced conversations about why the chief of pediatric cardiothoracic surgery at a major medical center was pretending to be a struggling clinic doctor to maintain family relationships built on deception and willful ignorance. Standing in my mother's hospital room, watching the pieces of my check scatter across the floor like confetti at a funeral, I'd realized that hiding my achievements hadn't protected my family's feelings. It had enabled their continued mistreatment of the daughter whose success they'd never acknowledged, because acknowledging it would have required admitting they'd been wrong about which child deserved their pride and investment. For 8 years, I'd been funding their lifestyle while listening to praise for Marcus's phantom accomplishments. For 8 years, I'd been sacrificing my own emotional needs to preserve their comfortable mythology about their golden child. Today, that mythology had finally collided with reality in a way that would forever change how we related to each other, if we continued to relate at all. Marcus arrived at Cleveland Clinic 48 hours after I'd torn up the check, making his entrance with the theatrical flair he'd perfected during 32 years of being the family's main character. He swept into the oncology ward wearing an expensive suit that somehow managed to look both professional and casual, his smile bright enough to power the hospital's emergency generators. "Mom! Dad!" His voice carried the warm enthusiasm of a son who'd rushed across the country to be with his family during their darkest hour, rather than someone who'd been unreachable for 3 days while his mother underwent emergency medical procedures. The transformation in my parents was immediate and complete. My mother, who'd been listless and withdrawn since her diagnosis, suddenly found energy to sit up in bed and arrange her hair. My father, who'd been slouching in defeat, straightened his shoulders and attempted to project strength for his returning hero. "Marcus, sweetheart, you didn't have to come," my mother said, though her radiant smile contradicted her words entirely. "I know how important your work is right now." "Nothing is more important than family," Marcus replied, leaning down to kiss her forehead with practiced tenderness. When Violet called and told me what was happening, I dropped everything and caught the first flight. When Violet called, I stared at my brother, processing the implication that I had been the one to contact him, that I had somehow failed to mention this crucial detail to our parents during the past 2 days of crisis management. "I didn't call you," I said quietly. Marcus's expression flickered for just a moment, a micro-expression of calculation that disappeared so quickly I might have imagined it. "Of course you did, sis. Tuesday night around 11 p.m. your time. You were very upset, understandably so." The lie was delivered with such confidence that I almost questioned my own memory. Marcus had always possessed the sociopath's gift for creating alternative realities through sheer force of conviction, making other people doubt their own experiences, rather than question his version of events. "Marcus called me Wednesday morning," my father said, his voice warm with gratitude. He'd already rearranged his entire schedule and booked flights before most of us were even awake. The timeline was impossible. I'd only learned of my mother's diagnosis Tuesday morning, and I'd spent Tuesday night at the hospital coordinating with her medical team. There had been no 11 p.m. phone call to California, no tearful plea for Marcus to abandon his business obligations. But my parents were looking at Marcus with such relief and happiness that contradicting his story would have seemed petty and destructive. Better to let them believe their golden child had rushed to their aid, rather than point out that he'd somehow learned of the emergency through supernatural means. "How is the consulting firm handling your absence?" I asked, curious to see how Marcus would explain leaving his supposedly crucial business negotiations to spend indefinite time in Ohio. "The beauty of building the right systems is that they can function without constant oversight," Marcus replied smoothly. "I've trained my team to handle client relationships with the same standards I maintain personally. Good leadership is about empowering others to succeed. Good leadership. Empowering others." Marcus had transformed his absence from work into evidence of his superior management philosophy, turning a potential weakness into another demonstration of his exceptional business acumen. "Tell us about the treatment plan," Marcus said, settling into the chair beside my mother's bed, with the authority of someone taking charge of a situation that required his expertise. "I've been researching experimental protocols and alternative therapies that might be more effective than traditional approaches." He'd been researching. In the 36 hours since supposedly learning about our mother's diagnosis, Marcus had conducted medical research that would inform treatment decisions for a complex cancer case, because apparently entrepreneurial consulting had provided him with sufficient medical background to evaluate oncology protocols. "The doctors have recommended immunotherapy combined with targeted radiation," my father explained, his voice carrying the respect reserved for Marcus's superior intellect. "It's expensive, but Violet was going to help with the costs." "Was going to help?" Marcus's eyebrows rose in calculated surprise. What changed? My parents exchanged the look that had become their signature response to my increasingly incomprehensible behavior. How could they explain that their dutiful daughter had suddenly refused to fulfill her designated role as family problem solver? "There was a misunderstanding," my mother said carefully. "Violet was upset about something and made some unfortunate choices, but I'm sure we can work things out." Unfortunate choices. 30 years of financial and emotional support reduced to unfortunate choices because I'd finally refused to write another check while listening to praise for a brother who contributed nothing but charm and empty promises. "Don't worry about the money," Marcus said, reaching out to squeeze my mother's hand. "I'll handle the treatment costs. Family takes care of family." The magnitude of his promise hit the room like a physical force. Marcus, the golden child who'd never contributed to family expenses, never helped with medical bills, never sacrificed his own interests for anyone else's benefit, was volunteering to cover nearly $50,000 in cancer treatment costs. "Marcus, that's too much," my father protested weakly, though his gratitude was evident. "We can't ask you to make that kind of sacrifice." "You're not asking," Marcus replied. "I'm offering. This is what family means, being there when it matters most." I watched this performance with growing fascination and horror, recognizing the sophisticated manipulation but unable to process its ultimate purpose. What was Marcus's endgame? How did volunteering to pay for expensive medical treatment serve his interests? Then I noticed his eyes, the cold calculation behind the warm smile, the predatory assessment of the situation's potential benefits. And I began to understand that Marcus's generous offer wasn't generosity at all. It was bait for a trap I couldn't yet see, but was already beginning to close around us. Over the next 3 days, I watched Marcus perform the role of devoted son with the precision of a method actor who'd spent months preparing for the part. He arrived at the hospital early, stayed late, and filled every moment with attentive conversation that made my parents glow with happiness despite their medical crisis. But small inconsistencies began accumulating like drops of water that eventually erode stone foundations. Details that didn't align with his carefully crafted narrative. Moments when his mask slipped to reveal something calculating beneath the devoted son facade. The first crack appeared during his conversation with Dr. Martinez about my mother's treatment protocol. Marcus asked sophisticated questions about immunotherapy combinations and survival statistics, demonstrating medical knowledge that seemed inconsistent with his supposed background in business consulting. "You seem very familiar with oncology terminology," Dr. Martinez observed during one particularly detailed discussion about tumor markers and treatment response indicators. "I've been researching extensively since Mom's diagnosis," Marcus replied smoothly. "When someone you love is facing cancer, you learn everything you can about their condition." But his knowledge went beyond internet research, or even medical journal articles. He understood complex therapeutic mechanisms and experimental protocols in ways that suggested direct experience with cancer treatment, experience that didn't fit with his story of rushing from California to support our family during an unexpected crisis. The second inconsistency involved his supposed business commitments. Marcus claimed to be managing client relationships remotely, taking important calls at strategic intervals to maintain the illusion of professional obligations that couldn't be completely abandoned. During one of these calls, I listened carefully to his side of the conversation, trying to understand the nature of his consulting work that was apparently sophisticated enough to command Fortune 500 attention, but flexible enough to allow indefinite absence. "The Peterson account needs those revisions by Friday," Marcus said into his phone, pacing the hospital corridor with authoritative energy. "Tell them we'll deliver the market analysis ahead of schedule, but the implementation timeline depends on their internal resource allocation." Generic business terminology that could apply to virtually any professional service. No specific industry references, no detailed technical discussions, no evidence that he was actually talking to anyone who expected deliverable work products. When the call ended, I approached him directly. "What kind of consulting do you actually do?" I asked. Marcus's smile was warm and condescending, the expression he'd perfected for dealing with his sister's inability to understand complex business concepts. "Strategic organizational development with a focus on operational efficiency optimization," he said, as if this phrase contained meaningful information rather than buzzwords strung together to sound impressive. "What does that mean in practical terms?" "I help companies identify systemic inefficiencies that reduce profitability and develop protocols for structural optimization that maximizes resource utilization while minimizing operational overhead." More buzzwords. More generic terminology that avoided any specific description of actual work being performed for actual clients producing actual results. The third red flag came from my investigation into his supposed success. Marcus had mentioned his Fortune 500 clients, his expanding business empire, his innovative approaches to market disruption that were attracting national attention from industry leaders. But when I searched online for Marcus Morrison Consulting, Morrison Strategic Development, or any variation of his claimed business identity, I found nothing. No company website, no professional profiles, no mentions in trade publications or business journals that should have featured someone whose work was supposedly disrupting entire industries. I expanded my search to include his personal social media presence, looking for evidence of the professional success that commanded such respect from our parents. His Facebook profile showed a carefully curated collection of photos from expensive restaurants, luxury hotels, and exotic travel destinations. The lifestyle of someone with significant disposable income, but no evidence of the business activities that supposedly generated such wealth. His LinkedIn profile was even more puzzling. Marcus claimed to be CEO and founder of Morrison Strategic Consulting, with a client list that included several recognizable Fortune 500 companies and a track record of transformational organizational development initiatives. But the recommendation section was empty. No colleagues or clients had endorsed his work or provided testimonials about his professional competence. For someone whose business success was apparently industry-leading, Marcus had managed to build his reputation without generating a single professional reference. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. While reviewing my bank statements to assess my financial capacity to cover additional medical expenses, I noticed a pattern of automatic transfers that I'd forgotten about. Monthly payments of $2,800 that had been going to a California bank account for the past 3 years. The account belonged to Monsieur Morrison, and the payments were being made to cover rent on an apartment in San Francisco's Mission District. I'd been subsidizing Marcus's housing costs while he supposedly built his consulting empire, funding his lifestyle while listening to our parents praise his financial independence and business acumen. For 3 years, I'd been unknowingly financing the comfortable life that Marcus presented as evidence of his professional success. The luxury restaurants, the travel, the expensive clothes, all funded by automatic transfers from the sister whose achievements were dismissed as insignificant compared to his phantom business empire. Standing in the hospital corridor, staring at the bank records that revealed years of financial deception, I finally understood that Marcus's offer to pay for our mother's treatment wasn't generosity. It was desperation. He was trying to maintain his facade of success using money that ultimately came from me, while positioning himself as the family hero who'd saved our mother's life through his own sacrifice and devotion. But facades built on lies eventually collapse, and I was about to make sure Marcus's collapse was as public and devastating as 30 years of family favoritism deserved. The private investigator I hired was a former FBI agent named Rebecca Walsh, who specialized in financial fraud and identity verification cases. Her rates were expensive, but her reputation for uncovering complex deceptions made the cost irrelevant when weighed against the potential consequences of allowing Marcus to continue manipulating our family. I need you to investigate someone who claims to be a successful business consultant, but whose story doesn't match the available evidence, I told Rebecca during our initial phone consultation. I suspect he's been lying about his professional achievements and possibly engaging in fraudulent activities. Rebecca's report arrived 72 hours later in a thick envelope marked confidential, extremely sensitive material. The contents read like a criminal case file rather than a background check on a family member. Marcus Morrison, the golden child my parents had worshipped for 32 years, didn't exist. The man living under that identity was actually David Chen, a convicted con artist who'd served 4 years in federal prison for securities fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. He'd been released 18 months ago and had apparently decided that impersonating successful family members was more profitable than traditional employment. According to Rebecca's investigation, David Chen had stolen the identity of the real Marcus Morrison, my actual brother who'd died in a car accident in Colorado 7 years ago. The accident had been reported in local newspapers, but hadn't been discovered by our family because Marcus had been traveling under an assumed name while trying to escape gambling debts that had made his life in Ohio unsustainable. David Chen had accessed Marcus's personal information through his work at an identity theft ring that targeted victims of accidents and deaths, creating false identities for criminals who needed to disappear from their previous lives. When the ring was busted by federal agents, Chen had kept Marcus's identity as insurance against future legal problems. The consulting business, the Fortune 500 clients, the innovative business strategies, all elaborate fiction designed to explain how a dead man had become professionally successful enough to command family respect and financial support. Chen had been living in San Francisco using Marcus's social security number, establishing credit accounts and rental agreements that created the appearance of legitimate success, while actually surviving on the monthly transfers I'd been making to support what I'd believed was my struggling brother. The apartment I'd been funding wasn't even Chen's primary residence. Rebecca's surveillance had revealed that he maintained 3 different identities in various California cities, running similar long-term cons against multiple families who believed they were supporting beloved relatives who'd achieved independent success. The medical knowledge he displayed during conversations about our mother's treatment wasn't the result of internet research. It was experience gained during his previous marriage to an oncology nurse, a relationship that had ended when she discovered his real identity and criminal background. Even his appearance wasn't entirely natural. Plastic surgery had altered his facial features to more closely resemble family photographs of the real Marcus, and colored contact lenses had changed his eye color from brown to the blue that Marcus had inherited from our mother. For 7 years, our family had been loving, supporting, and celebrating a professional criminal who'd assumed our dead son's identity to facilitate an elaborate con game that had netted him over $200,000 in direct financial support, plus immeasurable emotional gratification from being worshipped by victims who'd never suspected they were being systematically exploited. The photograph Rebecca had included in her report showed David Chen's prison mugshot, a face that was recognizably similar to the man I'd been calling my brother, but with subtle differences that became obvious once I knew to look for them. The nose was slightly different, the jawline had been surgically altered, and the confident expression that characterized Marcus was replaced by the dead-eyed stare of someone who viewed other people as resources to exploit. But the most devastating revelation was the timeline. Chen had assumed Marcus's identity and contacted our family just 3 months after the real Marcus had died in Colorado. Our grief over his long absence, our relief at his eventual return, our joy at his apparent success, all had been carefully orchestrated by a stranger who'd studied our family dynamics and crafted an identity specifically designed to exploit our emotional vulnerabilities. Every conversation we'd had with Marcus over the past 7 years had been lies. Every achievement we'd celebrated, every proud moment we'd shared, every dollar we'd sent to support his supposed independence. All had been part of an elaborate criminal conspiracy that had turned our family love into profitable deception. I sat in my hotel room, staring at evidence that would destroy my parents' understanding of their own lives, wondering whether truth was always preferable to comfortable lies. They'd spent 7 years believing their son had overcome his problems and achieved remarkable success, learning that he'd actually died while running from gambling debts, and that the man they'd been praising was a convicted criminal who'd stolen his identity, would devastate them in ways that might never heal. But the alternative was allowing Chen to continue his con, possibly escalating to even more serious crimes, as he became more confident in his ability to manipulate our family's emotions and resources. Standing at my mother's hospital bedside, watching her smile at the man she believed was her devoted son, I realized that some truths were too important to hide, regardless of the emotional devastation they would cause. Marcus, or rather David Chen, was about to face the consequences of 7 years of criminal deception, and my family was about to learn that the son they'd loved and celebrated for years had actually been dead the entire time. I called the family meeting for Thursday evening in my mother's hospital room, knowing that the institutional setting would provide some measure of emotional containment for the revelation that was about to shatter 30 years of family mythology. Dr. Martinez had agreed to remain available in case my mother required medical intervention when she learned that her beloved son was actually a criminal who'd been impersonating her dead child. Marcus arrived precisely on time, carrying flowers and wearing the concerned expression he'd perfected during his week-long performance as devoted son. My parents' faces lit up when he entered the room, the automatic joy that comes from seeing someone you love, someone whose presence represents comfort and security in the midst of medical crisis. "I have something important to share with everyone," I began, my voice steady, despite the magnitude of what I was about to reveal. "Information that will change how we understand our family and the relationships we've built over the past 7 years." Marcus's expression shifted slightly, the micro-calculation of someone assessing potential threat levels while maintaining his facade of brotherly concern. "Violet, if this is about the treatment funding, I've already told you I'll handle Mom's medical expenses," he said, his voice warm with the patient understanding reserved for dealing with difficult relatives. "There's no need for family conflict during such a stressful time." "This isn't about money," I replied, placing Rebecca Walsh's investigation report on my mother's bedside table. "This is about identity. This is about criminal fraud. This is about the fact that our real brother died 7 years ago, and the man we've been loving and supporting is a convicted felon who stole Marcus's identity to run an elaborate con game against our family." The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the ventilation system cycling air through the hospital room. My parents stared at me with expressions of complete incomprehension, as if I'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language that contained no recognizable words. "Violet, what are you talking about?" my father asked, his voice careful and concerned in the way people speak to relatives who might be experiencing mental health crises. Marcus, David Chen, remained perfectly still, his face displaying exactly the right mixture of confusion and hurt that an innocent person would show when confronted with bizarre accusations from an unstable family member. "Show them the photographs," I said, opening Rebecca's report to the first page of documentation. "Show them the prison records, the timeline of the identity theft, the evidence of systematic criminal fraud that's been ongoing for 7 years. My mother looked at the mugshot of David Chen, then at Marcus, then back at the photograph with growing bewilderment. The facial similarities were obvious, but so were the subtle differences that became apparent once you understood what you were looking at. "This doesn't make sense," she whispered. "This is Marcus. This is my son. I know my own child. Your son died in a car accident in Colorado 7 years ago," I said gently. "He was running from gambling debts when the accident occurred. The authorities couldn't immediately identify him because he was using false documentation. By the time his death was confirmed, David Chen had already assumed his identity and contacted our family claiming to have turned his life around." Marcus finally spoke, his voice carrying perfect pitch of wounded innocence mixed with concern for his sister's apparent psychological breakdown. "Violet, I don't know where this is coming from, but these accusations are extremely hurtful and completely false," he said. "I'm your brother. I've been part of this family for 32 years. Whatever problems we've had in the past don't justify this kind of attack on my identity and character." He was good. Even facing overwhelming evidence of his criminal deception, Chen was deploying emotional manipulation tactics that painted me as the aggressor and him as the victim of sibling jealousy that had escalated to delusional proportions. "Call the Colorado State Police," I said, handing my father Rebecca's report with the contact information clearly marked. "Ask them about the car accident that killed Marcus Morrison 7 years ago. Ask them about the body they buried in a potter's field, because no family members could be located for identification." My father took the report with trembling hands, his eyes scanning the detailed documentation of Chen's criminal history, the timeline of the identity theft, and the evidence of systematic fraud that had been perpetrated against multiple families in various states. "This says Marcus served 4 years in federal prison for fraud and identity theft," he read aloud, his voice hollow with growing comprehension. "This says he's actually David Chen, and that he's done this to other families." "It's fabricated," Marcus said quickly. "Someone has created false documentation to make it look like I'm a criminal. This is probably connected to business competitors who want to damage my reputation and client relationships." But the facade was finally cracking. The confident charm that had sustained his performance for 7 years was giving way to the desperate calculation of a cornered predator who was running out of manipulation tactics. "Prove it," I said simply. "Prove you're Marcus Morrison. Show us documentation of your birth, your childhood medical records, your school transcripts. Provide evidence of the consulting business that supposedly generates enough income to pay for Mom's treatment." Chen's eyes darted around the room, assessing escape routes and potential allies, finally understanding that his 7-year con was collapsing around him with the inevitability of a house of cards in a hurricane. "I don't have to prove anything to you," he said, his voice taking on an edge that my parents had never heard before. "You're obviously having some kind of breakdown, and I'm not going to participate in these delusional fantasies." But it was too late. The mask had slipped, revealing the predator beneath the loving son facade. And for the first time in 7 years, my parents were seeing David Chen instead of Marcus Morrison. The DNA test results arrived by courier at 3:47 p.m. on Friday, delivered to Cleveland Clinic with the efficiency of evidence that would either validate or destroy the foundation of our family's understanding of reality. I'd expedited the processing by calling in professional favors and paying premium rates for laboratory services that normally took weeks to complete. Dr. Martinez opened the sealed envelope in front of all of us, my parents, myself, and the man we'd believed was Marcus for 7 years. The tension in the hospital room was suffocating, thick with the weight of impending revelation that would permanently alter the trajectory of our family's future. The DNA comparison shows zero genetic relationship between the submitted sample and Violet Morrison, Dr. Martinez read from the laboratory report. The subject shares no familial DNA markers with the known family member, confirming that he is not biologically related to the Morrison family. The words hit my parents like physical blows. My mother made a sound that wasn't quite a scream, more like the noise air makes escaping from something that's been punctured. My father simply sat down heavily, his face cycling through stages of grief at accelerated speed. David Chen, for that was his real name, and there was no longer any pretense otherwise, stood perfectly still in the center of the room, finally dropping the performance he'd maintained for 7 years. The warmth disappeared from his expression, replaced by the cold calculation I'd glimpsed during moments when his mask had slipped. 7 years, my mother whispered, staring at him as if he were an alien species she'd never encountered before. 7 years I loved you. 7 years I was proud of you. 7 years I thought you were my son. You got what you wanted, Chen replied, his voice completely different now, harder, devoid of the warmth and charm that had characterized Marcus. You got a successful son who made you proud, who achieved everything you dreamed your real son would accomplish. What difference does biology make if the emotional results were the same? The sociopathic logic was breathtaking in its complete absence of empathy. Chen genuinely believed he'd provided a service to our family by impersonating our dead son, as if love and pride based on deception had the same value as genuine family relationships. The difference is that you're not Marcus, I said quietly. The difference is that our real son died alone in Colorado, while running from problems we never had the chance to help him solve. The difference is that we grieved for him, then believed he'd overcome his struggles, when actually he'd been dead the entire time we thought he was succeeding. Chen shrugged, the gesture of someone who found our emotional responses tedious and irrelevant. Your real son was a gambling addict who stole money from his friends and disappeared rather than face his responsibilities. I gave you a version of Marcus who was successful, reliable, and worthy of your pride. You should be grateful. The casual dismissal of our dead son, The reduction of Marcus's struggles to character flaws that justified identity theft revealed the depth of Chen's psychological manipulation. He'd studied our family dynamics carefully enough to present himself as the ideal child, but he'd never understood the fundamental love that makes families grieve for flawed relatives, rather than replacing them with improved imposters. "What about the money?" my father asked, his voice hollow with the realization that financial betrayal was probably just the beginning of what we'd discover. "The transfers Violet was making to your account, the support we provided over the years? Standard operating procedure," Chen replied matter-of-factly. "Families want to help successful relatives maintain their lifestyle and achieve their goals. I provided the success story, you provided the financial support. Everyone got what they wanted. Everyone got what they wanted. Except for the family who'd been systematically defrauded by a criminal who'd turned their love into profit, their pride into exploitation, their hope for their son's redemption into fuel for elaborate deception." Dr. Martinez had been monitoring my mother's vital signs throughout the conversation, concerned that the emotional shock might trigger cardiac complications that could compromise her cancer treatment. "Mrs. Morrison, I'm going to recommend some medication to help you process this revelation without additional medical stress." But my mother was staring at Chen with an expression I'd never seen before. Not just grief or betrayal, but a kind of primal rage that comes from discovering that someone has violated the most sacred aspects of human trust. "Get out," she said, her voice gaining strength from fury. "Get out of this room. Get out of this hospital. Get out of our lives. I never want to see you again." Chen's expression shifted to mild irritation, as if my mother was being unreasonably emotional about a business relationship that had simply run its course. "You might want to reconsider that position," he said calmly. "I still have detailed information about your financial situation, your medical records, your personal communications over the past 7 years. Information that could be very valuable to people who specialize in identity theft and financial fraud." The threat was delivered with casual confidence, revealing that Chen's con game had been even more sophisticated than we'd realized. He'd been collecting data that could facilitate additional crimes against our family, insurance against the possibility that his deception would eventually be discovered. But he'd made one crucial miscalculation. He'd threatened the wrong family member. "Actually," I said, pulling out my phone to show him Rebecca Walsh's report, "you might want to reconsider your position, because federal agents are already aware of your activities, your real identity, and your threats against the Morrison family. They're waiting in the hospital corridor to arrest you on charges of identity theft, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes." For the first time since I'd known him, David Chen looked genuinely surprised. The Golden Child's 7-year performance had finally reached its closing act. 6 months later, I sat in my mother's living room in Ohio, watching her arrange photographs on a table that told the true story of our family. Images of the real Marcus as a child, teenager, and young adult, before his struggles with gambling had driven him away from people who loved him despite his flaws. David Chen had been sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for identity theft, wire fraud, conspiracy, and threats against witnesses. The investigation had revealed similar cons against 4 other families in different states, with total financial damages exceeding $800,000. Our case had been the key to unraveling a broader criminal network that specialized in exploiting families' love and trust for financial gain. "I keep wondering if we failed him," my mother said, holding a photograph of Marcus at his high school graduation. "Genuinely proud, genuinely happy, genuinely our son. If we'd been better parents, maybe he wouldn't have felt the need to run away when his gambling became unmanageable." The real Marcus, we'd learned from Colorado authorities, had struggled with addiction for years before his death. He'd accumulated debts to dangerous people, had borrowed money from friends and family members in other states, and had been living under assumed names while trying to find legitimate work that would allow him to pay back what he owed. "He was an adult who made his own choices," I said gently. "Bad choices, but they were his to make. We can't control other people's decisions, even when we love them." My father, who'd been reading in his recliner, looked up from his book. "What I can't get over is how easily we believe the lie. For 7 years, we celebrated achievements that didn't exist, supported a lifestyle that was funded by fraud, and loved someone who was systematically exploiting our emotions. We believed because we wanted to believe," I replied. Chen was a professional who studied our family dynamics and crafted an identity specifically designed to exploit our hopes and expectations. He told us exactly what we wanted to hear about Marcus's redemption and success. The aftermath of Chen's arrest had forced uncomfortable conversations about our family dynamics, the favoritism that had shaped our relationships, and the way our worship of an imaginary successful son had blinded us to the actual achievements of the daughter who'd been supporting us for years. "We owe you an apology that goes far beyond what happened with David Chen," my mother said, setting down Marcus's photograph and looking at me directly. "We owe you an apology for 34 years of treating you like you were less important than your brother, for dismissing your achievements, for taking your support for granted while praising someone who contributed nothing but lies. We failed you long before Chen entered our lives," my father added. "We taught you that your accomplishments didn't matter as much as Marcus's, that your love and support were obligations rather than gifts, that your role in this family was to provide resources while receiving minimal recognition or appreciation." The apologies were meaningful, but they couldn't erase 34 years of feeling invisible in my own family. What mattered more was the change in our daily interactions, the way my parents now asked about my work with genuine interest, the way they celebrated my professional achievements, the way they treated me as an equal partner in family decisions, rather than as a supporting character in someone else's story. My mother's cancer treatment had been successful, funded by a combination of insurance coverage and my financial contributions that were now acknowledged and appreciated, rather than taken for granted. She was in remission, with an excellent prognosis and a new understanding of which child had actually been there when she needed support most. "What happens next?" she asked, settling into her favorite chair, with the careful movements of someone still recovering from chemotherapy. "With your career, your life in Seattle, your plans for the future?" "I've been offered the department chair position at Johns Hopkins," I said. "It would mean relocating to Baltimore, building a new pediatric cardiac program, and probably earning national recognition for work I've been doing quietly for years." My parents exchanged a look, not the diplomatic evasion I remembered from childhood, but genuine concern for my happiness and professional fulfillment. "That sounds like an incredible opportunity," my father said. "Are you excited about the challenge?" The question was simple, but it represented a fundamental shift in our family dynamic. For the first time in my adult life, my parents were asking about my goals and dreams rather than assuming my role was to support other people's ambitions. "I'm excited about finally being recognized for work I love," I said. "I'm excited about building something significant in my own name, rather than hiding my achievements to protect other people's feelings." "Then you should take it," my mother said firmly. "You should take every opportunity you've earned through your own talent and dedication. You should stop making yourself smaller to accommodate people who don't appreciate what you bring to their lives." I looked around the living room where I'd grown up feeling perpetually second best, where Marcus's achievements had been celebrated while mine were ignored, where I'd learned to accept invisible status as the price of maintaining family relationships. Today, the room felt different, not because the furniture had changed, but because my parents were finally seeing me as the daughter I'd always been, rather than the disappointing comparison to a son who'd never actually existed. For the first time in 34 years, I felt like I truly belonged in my own family, and for the first time in my life, I was ready to build something entirely my own.